George V was born on the 3rd of June 1865 in London. He was the second son of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, the then Prince and Princess of Wales. He was a grandchild of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom through his father and Christian IX of Denmark through his mother. As the second son, George was never expected to one day be king. George and his older brother Albert Victor were educated together, and neither of them excelled academically. At the age of 12, George and Albert Victor began training in the Navy, and from 1879, both of the brothers served on HMS Bacant. They toured the British Empire together. Unable to speak French or German, their grandmother, Queen Victoria, sent them to Lausanne, which resulted in very little learning of either language. As an adult, George continued to work in the Navy, serving under his uncle, Prince Alfred. While stationed in Malta, he fell in love with his cousin, Princess Marie of Edinburgh. Their mothers disliked the match. Alexandra thought the family too pro-German, and Marie's mother disliked England. Marie refused George and instead married Ferdinand, the future king of Romania. In 1891, Albert Victor proposed to Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, more commonly known as Mary. But 6 weeks later, in January 1892, Albert Victor died of pneumonia, caused by influenza. George was thrust into second in the line of succession. Queen Victoria pushed her grandchild to propose to Mary. George and Mary grew closer together during their shared mourning, and in 1893 George proposed. Mary accepted. That same year, on the 6th of July 1893, George and Mary were wed. They remained devoted to each other, never being unfaithful. George was unable to express how he felt in speech, but he wrote many letters to his wife, as did she, expressing their devotion and love for each other. George's career in the Navy ended when he became second in line. He was given the title of Duke of York in 1892 and began to receive constitutional history lessons. George and Mary would go on to have 5 sons and a daughter together. He and Mary were strict and distant with their children, not much different to how royalty raised their children at the time. They lived in York Cottage on the Sandringham estate and led a simple, quiet life. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria passed away, and George's father ascended the throne. George was then given the title of Prince of Wales and toured the British Empire with his wife. As Prince of Wales, George was given access to state documents, unlike how his father had been when he was Prince of Wales, and George also allowed his wife to read the papers. He valued her advice, and she helped him to write speeches. George supported reforms in naval training, with cadets being enrolled at the age of 12 and receiving the same education regardless of class. These reforms were eventually implemented. On the 6th of May 1910, Edward VII died and George became king. He took the regnal name of George V. George took offence to the anti-Catholic wording of the Ascension Declaration that he was supposed to make during the opening of Parliament. He refused to open Parliament unless the offensive phrases were changed, and the Ascension Declaration Act of 1910 was passed, which removed the phrases. On the 22nd of June 1911, George and Mary were crowned together at Westminster Abbey. That same year they travelled to India for the Delhi Durbar, where they were crowned Emperor and Empress of India. He was the only Emperor of India to actually be present at his own Delhi Durbar. While in India, he expressed disgust at the racial segregation. When George came to the throne, the People's Budget had been rejected by the House of Lords, which was unusual as Lords normally did not veto budget bills. The Prime Minister attempted to reduce the power of the Lords, but it kept being blocked. The Prime Minister asked George to grant another general election and to create sufficient Liberal peers if the Lords blocked legislation again. George agreed to the dissolution, and the Parliament Act of 1911 was passed. which removed the power of the Lords to veto bills. On the 4th of August 1914, World War I began. Britain and its allies were at war with the German Empire and its allies. George and his family were cousins of the German Kaiser and bore German titles. In a response to the growing anti-German sentiment at the time, George changed the royal house's surname to Windsor in 1917, and all of his British relatives relinquished their German titles. He gave his male relatives British peerages and titles. That same year, he restricted who could have the style of Royal Highness and who could have the title of Prince or Princess. By 1919, any of George's relatives who had fought on the German side of the war had their British peerages and titles revoked. In 1917, George's first cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, was overthrown in the Russian Revolution. George initially decided to grant his cousins asylum, but revoked his offer after fears of revolution being sparked in the UK. The Tsar, his wife and children were murdered in 1918. George sent a British warship to Russia to rescue the extended members of the Russian imperial family. 2 months after the end of the First World War, Prince John, the king's youngest son, died at the age of 13 from an epileptic fit. His death caused immense grief for both of his parents. From 1932, George began to deliver a royal Christmas speech on the radio. He would continue this every year. By 1935, after 25 years on the throne, George was much loved by the British people. George's relationship with his heir Edward, or David as he was called in the family, deteriorated as the years went on. George was disappointed that Edward had failed to settle down and start a family. He was appalled by his affairs with married women also. In stark contrast, he was fond of Albert, his second son, who had married and had 2 daughters who George doted on. George's health began to suffer as he aged. He smoked heavily, and by 1935 he was also taking oxygen. The death of his sister Victoria in December 1935 affected him. He became depressed, and this weakened his already poor health. From the middle of January 1936, he grew weaker and drifted in and out of consciousness. On the 20th of January 1936, the king's doctor administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine to the king to put him out of his suffering. The royal family were not aware of his actions, and the cause of the king's death did not come to light until the 1980s, when the doctor's diaries were published. George's eldest son, Edward, succeeded as Edward VIII, but abdicated by the end of the year in favour of Albert, who ascended the throne as George VI.